Hi, I'm Ben Friedman, Policy Director at Defense Priorities, and today we're doing a live stream with the title, Can Ukraine Still Win? Evaluating U.S. Interests and Policy Options. We're going to go for an hour. We have three excellent panelists, starting with Mike Kofman, who's a senior fellow in Russia and the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Secondly, we have Emma Ashford, who is a senior fellow with the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program at the Stimson Center. And thirdly, we have our own from Defense Priorities, Daniel Davis, who's a senior fellow here and also has a YouTube podcast show called Daniel Davis Deep Dive. So with that, we're going to kick it off. And the sort of framing question we want everyone to talk on for 3 to 5 minutes is how Ukraine, having, I think by everyone's account, suffered a backwards year in 2023 in terms of the war, can do better, and what U.S. interests dictate. How should the U.S. Want Ukraine to shift its war policy to get to a better outcome? So with that, Mike Kofman, please take it away.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ben. And good to be here on the panel with you and Emma and Dan. So the way I would frame it is along the lines of a recent thought piece that I've done with Rob Lee and Dara Massico, that if there is going to be a vision for this coming year that I think can be resourced and has a theory of success behind it, it's an approach framed as sort of hold, build, and strike, that the focus of this year for Ukrainian forces and for Western efforts should first be to hold, to effectively entrench, consolidate Ukrainian forces, fix a lot of the issues in the force, and try to exhaust Russian forces at the peak of Russian defense spending this year, make any gains for them incremental and quite costly. And I think that's feasible. The second is the more challenging one, and that is essentially rebuilding Ukrainian forces, reconstituting them, and trying to restore the offensive potential to the force. That would definitely require more resources, heavy investment in training. Ukraine would have to mobilize a lot more men, and investments both in Ukraine and in the West in defense industrial capacity, some of which are already being made, and others I think would be quite lucrative for both sides in either scenario, meaning they're the sort of things we would have to invest in, both because of the direction technology is going, both because of the many years it'll take to rearm the countries in Europe who have expended arsenals and stockpiles on this war, and because Ukraine can make quite a few things that it needs to sustain the fight itself now. And third is strike, essentially an expanded strike campaign this year, taking advantage of some of the things Ukraine was able to do last year in retaking the initiative in parts of the Black Sea, focus on Crimea, focus on Russian forces behind the lines. This is not a substitute for offensive operations, nor is it a war-winning strategy, but it'll create challenges and problems for the Russian forces. It'll help suppress some of their force regeneration over the course of this year. And maybe in the best case scenario, Ukraine can retake the initiative next year. And in the worst case scenario, Ukraine can still effectively hold, and Russia will not be on track to realize its war aims by 2025 or 2026. And that'll put it in a relatively still weaker position if we look at any negotiations that might follow. Certainly not the position of confidence or the relative confidence the Russian leaders are projecting at this moment. And lastly, I think U.S. does have significant interests at stake. We certainly don't want Ukraine to end up having to negotiate from a position of weakness, which may end up with it losing territory and Russia imposing its will in the country. I think we have a strong vested interest in avoiding a wholesale revision of territory in Europe by force. We've been trying to maintain this principle in Europe since World War II and been fairly successful at it. Part of the reason for that isn't just values-based. It's also because it substantially reduces the likelihood that we end up having to fight another major war in Europe, since many wars between states are still primarily over territory. And lastly, if Russia is successful, the cost of maintaining security in Europe for the United States, which has extensive extended security commitments to these countries via NATO and outside of NATO, will go up. I mean, U.S. allies will be far more concerned if Ukraine is perceived as having been defeated It's also going to raise this cost at a time when the U.S. is trying to focus its strategy much more on the Pacific and a looming contest with China. Russia's spending much more now on national defense than it was previously. This is a structural change, militarization of the Russian economy, if you want to put it that way. And it's not something they're going to roll back very easily. So Russia's going to be a problem moving forward. The question is, do you want a Russian military that's tied down in Ukraine, having to deal with the Ukrainian armed forces? Do you want a Russian military that's substantially weakened by the fight, or essentially is unable to restore all its force capacity from the war and free that capability to potentially further challenge European security architecture? In the sense that you're much better off with the war ending on favorable terms for Ukraine than Moscow walking away believing that they exhausted much of the West, that they feel they had won the war, which may not be objectively true, but might be the impression they walked away from. And that may not embolden them to just go off and invade somebody next, but nonetheless, you have a revanchist power with an imperialist mindset that's spending a lot on defense, that's likely going to reconstitute its military faster than a lot of folks expect, that's your adversary, and you don't want them coming away feeling that they just won a war in Europe and you were one of the material parties to that conflict. Okay, I'll end at that.
Thanks. Emma, take it away.
Great. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me for what I do think is just a really important topic of conversation. I think in Washington, a lot of the conversation in recent weeks is centered around, will there be funding or won't there be funding for Ukraine? And not nearly as much on what a nuanced policy shift might actually look like in that context. I think I agree with a significant amount of what Mike just said. I think in particular, this is a fairly dangerous moment for Ukraine, right? They are facing supply shortages, manpower issues, Western funding shortfalls. But I think one problem that we have failed to reckon with is that a lot of this was visible much further out. This is not something that came out of the blue in December of 2023. Last year's counteroffensive, not as successful as the Ukrainians had hoped, but I think a lot of folks pointed out at the start, relied very much on a theory of Russian collapse that seemed fairly unlikely. The fact that Western political will would flag was visible years out, right? That the further countries are away from the conflict, the less likely they are to be able to sustain popular support for significant money flowing towards Ukraine. And this is what we see. The states in Eastern Europe remain mostly quite committed to Ukraine, and the further west you move, the more that commitment is coming into question. And so I think we foresaw many of these problems over the last few years, but really didn't do a lot to address it. And I would say the big problem is that the US approach here has been a very, very ambitious strategy, and one that's largely untethered from the realities of war termination as we understand it, right? The Biden administration has said a number of times that they believed that what they were attempting to do was put Ukraine in the best possible position to negotiate an end to this war. But when you actually looked at the funding, at the appropriations, you looked at what people were talking about in terms of the counteroffensive, there really wasn't any sort of consensus on when that negotiating position might have actually come into being. And I think looking back now, you can perhaps even make an argument that last spring, prior to the counteroffensive, when there was still the possibility that it could have been very effective, that might have been a point of maximum leverage to negotiate a peace deal with Russia. There's no real prospects of peace on good terms for Ukraine right now. And I agree with Mike that it is, I think, in US interests and Western interests not to see Ukraine collapse, not to see Russia make significant additional gains, and not to see Ukraine forced into a punitive peace. With that said, I think the place where I disagree is on the potential for Western support for a long-term sort of building towards further offensives strategy in Ukraine. And I think, I am not a military analyst. And so for me, I'm primarily focusing on the political aspects of this. And I would argue that it is not politically sustainable not in the United States, and certainly not in parts of Western Europe, to be talking about a 5-year campaign of Ukraine moving towards taking back territory. So the alternative is not simply abandoning Ukraine, which would be, I think, quite damaging for Western interests. The alternative is finding some sort of middle ground where we can enable Ukraine to not make significant further losses, where we can deny the Russians what they actually want in terms of further gains, but at a lower cost and in a way that is more sustainable. And my colleague Kelly Greco and I have to give a shout out to her because she was very instrumental in this piece that we wrote a month or so back. And we've advocated for a policy of victory through defense in Ukraine. So perhaps we cannot enable Ukraine to take back all its territory, but we can enable Ukraine to deny Putin further gains. And so we advocate for increasing static fortifications, digging in Ukrainian lines, using anti-personnel mines, anti-tank mines, all of these things that the Russians have done over the last year that has made them quite effective on the defense. And we argued that this approach is cheaper, it's more effective, it helps with manpower problem because defense is easier on manpower than offense. And we also argued that even in the absence of US funding, this is an area where European states can actually contribute a fair amount. There are things that they can supply that are helpful for fortifications and building that aren't necessarily even coming from the military space. Now, there are still some areas where Ukraine is likely to need supplies, munitions from Europe and from the United States, particularly things like artillery ammunition, air defense systems. But it would not necessarily require this, 60+ billion that was in the supplemental that the Biden administration has been trying to get Congress to pass. And so I'll wrap up in just a second, but just to say, I think for us, the most important point is that this is not a purely military strategy, that this has to be matched by a political strategy, perhaps a lower funding request from the administration tied to a clear strategy that is achievable. That might be something that is more politically palatable to voters. Perhaps looking for ways to send this message that, the West is supporting Ukraine for the long haul, but in a defensive capacity rather than this sort of long-term offensive capability. So I will turn it over to Danny, and thank you.
Go ahead, Danny. Thanks, Emma.
All right, so I'm a little bit going to be somewhat different than most people, not just on this panel, but I think most of the analysts, at least in Washington D.C., in that I argue very persuasively, in my view, that this war cannot be won militarily by Ukraine, period. At any point, no matter whether they get $60 billion from the U.S., if they got sustained funding for a long time, it will not matter because the fundamentals that go into building combat power and national military power are decisively in Russia's favor. When this war started in February 2022, Russia was exposed for having terrible strategic plans and for having an operational force that was far weaker than it thought it was, and the Ukraine force was far more vibrant than they thought that they were as well. And that was really exposed throughout the summer of 2022, and then super exposed in the fall of 2022 when Ukraine had its signature wins in the Kherson direction and in the Kharkiv direction and in the north. But that is going to be viewed, I'm very confident, as the high water mark for Ukraine, that they won't move again. I think Emma just touched on it a second ago. If you were ever going to try to negotiate an end to the war on terms that were beneficial to Ukraine, or at least to give them the best view, it was right then. It was in like the December, January timeframe where everything was going in their favor. They had just reconquered a lot of territory because Russia had terrible plans at both the operational and even the tactical level. And they were, had that forced mobilization of 300,000. And they were scrambling to get people to plug the gaps. They were in chaos at that point. That was the absolute best time. Unfortunately, that instead gave Ukraine the belief that they could win the war. And definitely Zelensky to this day still says his objective is the 1991 borders, which is just fantasy. There's no capacity to do that. In the intervening year plus now, Russia has recovered a lot of its failures. They've learned from their failures, and now then they are employing much better tactics, much better operational maneuver, and we're probably going to find out just how much better they are at the operational maneuver if they're able to exploit this victory they just had in Avdiivka. What the United States should do is to recognize ground truth reality. Ukraine will never win the war. And if Ukraine is not going to win the war, and that's defined as shoving Russia out of its territory, then you have to do what is politically attainable, what is militarily attainable. And that is, in this part, I definitely agree with Emma, is that our strategy in the U.S. should shift to, we're going to provide you defensive weapons to help you maintain the line of contact, to help you make any kind of push by the Russians as expensive as possible, while simultaneously working towards a negotiated settlement. Now, I know many people want to say, well, Russia isn't interested in a settlement. No, that's not true. They are. And you don't have to take Putin's word for it. In his recent interview with Tucker Carlson, he's been saying that from the outset. He's never said anything differently. He repeated it then. But even if you didn't hear any of his words, just look at the conditions on the ground. Putin has everything to gain from having the negotiated deal as best he can to end the war for multitude of reasons. But the idea that he wants to conquer all of Ukraine is complete nonsense, because he's well aware that especially the further west you get from the Dnieper, the greater the hatred is for Russia, and that it would be a Pyrrhic victory at the absolute best case should he end up conquering all that, because then he would have to garrison millions of troops in an extremely hostile area, which would certainly turn into a guerrilla type warfare that would bleed him indefinitely. He knows that, and he has no interest in doing that. What he has a lot of interest in doing is putting some kind of buffer between him and Russia. So he would love to have a rump state of Ukraine, basically what exists right now, that's neutral, that's not going to join NATO. He said that from the outset, and he's still saying it to this day, that is the basis for negotiation. Now, I have also been arguing that the longer that the Ukraine side waits to have a negotiated settlement, the worse their terms are going to get. If they had done it in the November-December timeframe of 2022, 23, they had every chance to have even more territory. They would have not lost Avdiivka. They would have not lost Bakhmut. Those are now gone, and they're not coming back. There's one thing I think is fair to say, is that Putin's not going to give anything back unless you get a really good deal in some other way. So even that, I wouldn't eliminate the possibility. But the longer we wait, the less likely Putin is to be any kind of a generous mood and give terms that are good to Ukraine. But I think that there's every reason to believe that Ukraine can come out with a deal to where they are neutral, but have every opportunity to build their own national security capabilities, to build their military back, to have bilateral relations with anyone in Europe they want to, certainly economic and diplomatic relations, so that they're not surrendering. They're not becoming, demilitarized. They're just becoming neutral. So the future can still be a good place for Ukraine. That can still be connected to the West in many ways. So that's critical to understand. No one's saying that Ukraine should surrender, but absolutely not. They don't need to, unless they keep trying to go to a victory. Unless Zelensky says, no, I'm going to keep trying to win, then he has the possibility of actually being defeated on the battlefield. And that's one thing I think that differs from most everybody in this town anyway, is that Ukraine has a greater chance of losing the war if they keep fighting than of even finding a place for a negotiated settlement, which they don't appear to be even pursuing at the moment. And everything that you want to look at, whether it's financial, economic situation, military, industrial capacity, manpower issues, everything is in Russia's favor, and it's increasing over time, because definitely Putin is committed to this. His people seem to be backed up by this, and they're going to be willing to go, even if it takes more years. And Ukraine doesn't have the manpower. They don't have the industrial capacity. Emma is completely right that there is not the political will in the West to continue doing this long term. I mean, just look at the U.S. here. Since September, we've been delaying giving even $60 billion after somewhere around $113 billion in the first 18 months or so. And that's not even certain, but there's no appetite for making that an annual kind of thing. I mean, there's just no potential, in my view, that that's going to be sustained, which would be necessary just to maintain the line of contact to prevent Ukraine from losing even more ground, much less having an offensive capacity. Consider this, and my last point here. We spent, U.S. and West altogether, over $200 billion in the first 18 months of this war. We trained Ukraine troops. We provided intelligence support, gave them all kinds of weapons. And I'm talking like some of the top line stuff in cumulative, over 5,000 total military vehicles by the U.S. alone. And it didn't even dent the needle, didn't even move the needle at all when they tried their offensive operation. They lost probably hundreds of thousands up to date, maybe even more. There is no rational path to say that they're going to get even an equal amount of firepower in the future. Nobody's willing to give them hundreds more artillery pieces, APCs, tanks, any of those kinds of things. And without that capacity, without the replacing the fact that they don't have the ability to excel in the air, they don't have enough air defense missiles, we don't have enough to give them, and they don't have mine clearing equipment or the replacement of armored vehicles or the training necessary at the highest levels to be able to do what they failed to do in 2023. There is no rational path. So it should be interest of the United States and of Europe and of Zelensky to say, let's change tack and let's achieve, or let's go after something that's achievable, which is a negotiated settlement to end the war. That's all I have to say for now.
Okay, thanks, Danny. I'm going to let Mike and Emma respond to that. I would note that both Mike and Emma wrote articles that they refer to. Mike wrote an article with Rob Lee and Dara Masakata, came out January 26, which was called Hold, Build, and Strike, a Vision for Rebuilding Ukraine's Advantage in 2024 with War on the Rocks. Emma wrote in Foreign Affairs with Kelly Greco on January 10th, How Ukraine Can Win Through Defense. So I think people should know that they're sort of speaking of those articles. Both you, Mike, and Emma have a kind of theory of victory for Ukraine, or at least of greater success, whatever we want to call it, that differs from what Danny said. Danny said that, Ukraine can only sort of go backwards now in terms of its negotiating position. Emma, if I understood your article correctly, you and Kelly argued that through defense, focusing on defense, Ukraine can wear Russia down and get into a more advantageous position for some kind of eventual war settlement negotiations. Mike, in your article with Rob Lee and Dara Masakot, you argued, I think, that through going back on offense in 2025, that Ukraine could get to a better negotiating position. So maybe you could both just speak to sort of how you disagree with Danny and how you see Ukraine getting sort of back on the front foot, at least to have some kind of settlement talk. Mike, go ahead first if you want, when you're done sipping.
Okay. So yeah, quite a few points on the board, and so make for a lively discussion. I think Emma's asking, to what extent is it sustainable? So what I was thinking, or at least I and my colleagues in laying out a vision, was we weren't looking at a 5-year plus strategy for the war. We're looking to move from the very short-term lurches of 6-month planning, which is what the United States has been doing in this war, essentially going from one offensive plan to another offensive plan, to at least something that's a bit more long-term, like 18 months, and to put the war on a more sustainable footing. And we have to get into the conversation. Well, what does winning mean? So I think the goal, let's be clear, the goal behind the offensive for the U.S., and I think the goal still today, is not to enable Ukraine to take back all of its territory. I understand that's Ukraine official policy, but I don't think that was the theory of victory, right? It was to put Ukraine in a position where it can attain decisive leverage to negotiate with Russia war termination from a favorable position, and then to attain a durable peace. Because otherwise, whatever piece of paper they sign with Russia, Russia could then take a year or two off, reconstitute its forces, and attack again, relaunch the war. This war is a continuation of the 2014 war. Anyway, so this was kind of I think the theory of success. Crimea often comes up as a way of attaining leverage, right? As one of those particularly sensitive points that Ukraine could affect and the Russian leadership would care about. Now, is it feasible to put Ukraine in this position over the course of the next 18 months? Yeah, potentially. Of course, it requires both them and us making a number of the right choices. I don't think it honestly costs that much. If you look at half the military assistance being requested as half of that $60 billion package, it's $30 billion. it's certainly not that much relative to the stakes. It's certainly not that much relative to the cost it's actually inflicting to the Russian armed forces over the course of this fight. Plus, most of the money in military assistance is spent here in the United States. It's replenishment funding for us. Let's be serious. This money isn't being sent. Well, this money is not being sent to Ukraine. If we look out over the course of the next 12 months, we are actually in a much better position a year from now than we are now. And a lot of people, I think, just don't get that, right? We are going to be making a lot more artillery ammo in 2025, so are the Europeans, than we are now. We're going to be making more air defense interceptors. We have plenty of equipment. The Secretary of Defense just doesn't want to release it until Congress authorizes further replenishment funds. Like, we're not short on Bradleys and this gear. We're currently holding on to 4.2 billion PDA because it's not clear, Presidential Drawdown Authority funding, because it's not clear that Congress will authorize any more funding this year, Ben. Right, so we don't know. We might 4.2 billion might be all there is to spend on this war this year, for all the SecDef knows. But then last year, he basically said, "I'm not releasing any more equipment unless Congress authorizes replenishment fund." He didn't say we're completely out of kit. That's it. The entire U.S. Army apparently only had the 2 brigades of MRAPs that we sent and 1 brigade worth of Bradleys and 1 brigade worth of Strikers. This is the epic amount of equipment that people think we provided for the offensive in 2023, which consisted of 9 brigades, 4 of which were principally armed by us, the rest by European allies. Actually, wasn't that much equipment at all. The political issues that Emma raises, I think, are very important and notable, but they don't have much to do with strategy or the price or the facts of the case. I've not seen Republicans calling up military analysts to help explain to them what is and is not possible with U.S. resources, how the war is going. I'm not sure they really care. It has everything to do with domestic politics, and I think we get that. The people holding up funding are just as opposed to a defensive strategy that Emma proposes as they are to any other strategy. And they can take any foreign policy issue and hold it hostage on the base of this domestic political gambit. Meaning, whatever differences Emma and I might have, they might be intellectual, they might be an arsenal of small differences, that's not what's holding up the train. And I don't think the Republicans remotely care about it right now. 2 more points, I'll close on it. So first, Dan, I understand what you're saying, but I think you grossly overstate the case in Russia's favor. Russia is significantly constrained on the timeline in which it is trying to win the war. It has structural manpower limitations. Okay, it is able to regenerate combat strength to an extent and is able to replace losses. We saw it being able to do that last year, but they're not even able to generate enough manpower to rotate the people they initially mobilized. Russia's economy is a very tight labor market. They have a lot of men on paper, but those are fantasy numbers. In reality, they have very low unemployment, low availability of manpower with skills, and an economy with inflation issues, which means they are constantly competing with themselves in other parts of the economy for this labor. It's not nearly that accessible, okay? Second, it takes them a long time to convert these people into combat power. Let's look at Avdiivka. They spent 5 months fighting over the small pocket, and they threw away much more than an army's worth of equipment. Very significant losses in terms of gear. And then I think there's a bit of an is-shoot problem here when we talk about Russian military capacity in the future of this conflict. Yes, if we cut support to Ukraine, then it can only begin losing from this point forward. But if we do not cut support from Ukraine, Ukraine actually stands a fairly good chance of attriting a lot of Russian combat power over the next year and a half. Look at the realities that Russia faces. Russia has major equipment limitations. Most of its force is feeding off of a Soviet legacy, and there's only a couple of years worth of that equipment. And when you see Russians beginning to launch attacks with T-55s and T-62s, it's not a great look, all right? Let's be very honest. And that's what's been happening literally over the past several weeks. So they actually are on a timeline, and that timeline is not an unlimited timeline to win the war. It's a lot shorter than people think. They have constraints on barrel life. They have a lot of issues in the rate at which they can regenerate offensive potential. And most importantly, they can restore quantity, but it's very hard for them to restore quality of personnel. Their ability to scale how they employ their forces is pretty constrained. The most we've seen of Avdiivka, battalion level attacks, and then went right back down to something at the size of no more than a squad or a platoon. Most of the fighting at this war is about platoon to company level, not much more than that. And the Russian military hasn't showed significantly greater capacity than the Ukrainian armed forces in that regard after they lost the better part of their force in the early part of the war. And lastly, to Emma, I understand the pitch on defense, but defense to me is kind of a loose little strategy. I think it is only a loser for Ukraine in the West, right? Unless the West helps Ukraine with artillery ammunition, with air defense ammunition, and helps provide funds to enable their mobilization and recapitalization of the force, Russia is going to be attriting Ukrainian forces over time. Ukrainian defense is also not sustainable without significant efforts and investments. Russian strike capacity is only increasing, okay? Here's where Dan's points have some salience, which is without significant investment on the part of the West, the Russian offensive potential, right? It's not a decisive advantage yet, but it will grow over time. And so it's going to be hard to sustain that defense. The last part, unless the war is settled one way or another, or at least a ceasefire is attained, sustained Russian strike will make it so it's very hard for anybody to invest in Ukraine. People will steadily leave, okay? And so from a military standpoint, the strategy might make sense, but it spells a slow death for the vitality and the future of the country. How are Ukrainians supposed to live with that strategy? What does it mean for them, for the future of their country? So I'll leave it at that because I think I tried to address as many points as I could. All well made.
Okay, Emma, did you want to respond?
Sure. Yeah. Let me just pick up on sort of 3 points here, because I think they're worth pointing out. So the first is actually what Mike was talking about last a little bit, and something that Danny said. He said, everything is running in Russia's favor, even in the economic space. I'm not sure that's quite right. I think actually we have seen Ukraine today is in a better economic position than it was 6, 9, 12 months ago. I think there's no longer imminent danger of Ukrainian economic collapse. There's no longer nearly as big a risk that the Ukrainians are going to print themselves into inflation mania. And a large chunk of that has to do with European support coming through. So it's certainly not good for Ukraine that the war continues in the economic space, but they're not nearly as constrained as they were a year ago. You can flip that around though, and say, well, where is the advantage on Russia's side? And I think, one area I really would like to hear more thoughts from everybody on is the manpower question, because it seems to me that, even if Ukraine increasingly has some advantages in the economic space, even if they manage to get significantly more Western support, the manpower problem is a perennial one. The age of recruits is creeping up. There's a huge, as you all know, there's a huge mobilization debate that's going on in country right now in Ukraine. And, I do wonder if that might be where political will in Kiev starts to fail eventually. So I think, I don't think it's as simple as saying that one side has the advantage, but across different areas, we could look at areas of advantage. Second point, to Danny's comment that Ukraine will never win the war. Again, I think we have to talk about what winning means. And my strong preference would be for us to look at the totality of this conflict and say, holy crap, Ukraine already won this war, which they have to a very real sense. That Ukraine continues to exist as a state, has the majority of its territory, most of its population, and it has, won itself the potential to be folded into European institutions in the future. So, this is not a loss for Ukraine compared to what they were looking at, on February 20th, 2022. But we have increasingly, unfortunately, I think both in Kiev and in Western capitals, defined victory as victory can only come if every inch of Ukrainian territory is retrieved. Victory can only come if Russia is forced into a punitive peace, if the government in Moscow falls, none of which are very realistic end states. And so, again, I think no matter what your military strategy is, part of the approach for any White House, for Western European leaders here, has to be some sort of strategy that redefines victory for the public in a way that is achievable. Whatever you end up defining that as, whether it's Mike's strategy or mine or a different one, we have to sell that as victory, not as a loss. And then just a third point on the politics of it all here in the US. I don't think it's quite fair, as Mike says, to blame it all on domestic politics. Certainly, there is a domestic political angle to this related to Donald Trump, related to the 2024 election. But I think if you look at some of those, particularly in Congress, who are talking the loudest about this. There is an underlying strategic concern. It's about long-term distribution of resources between, Europe, Middle East, Indo-Pacific. It's about how long this war is sustainable for. And I think, it's entirely true to say that if the US were to send, the supplemental money to Ukraine today, were to draw down more equipment, there really probably wouldn't be that much cost. But if that is going to continue for another 1, 2, 3, 5 years, then it does start to force you into more difficult choices. And I think, that is, part of what congressional critics are trying to get at with the understanding that Congress is sort of a blunt instrument, right? They can really only cut off funding or maybe hold oversight hearings. That's kind of what Congress can do. And I think they're trying to push the administration towards elucidating a more realistic strategy, whatever that actually is.
Danny, did you have some brief response to that?
A couple of things. First of all, I agree with Michael on the fact that this is an extension of 2014, and the same thing that Russia has been doing from the outset and what they've been supporting. But I think that also talks to a different outcome in that Michael said that if they have some kind of negotiated settlement, then Russia would rearm, rebid, and then a couple of years later they could attack again. And I would argue that the only way that they would do that is if we don't address the problem that has been existing since 2008, which Putin has been saying consistently throughout, and that is NATO in Ukraine on his border. If the negotiated settlement ends with a neutral Ukraine, there is no reason why Russia would want. They don't have some innate desire to just go to war. They actually don't. They want security on their border. The people are supporting this war right now because they feel like it's the entire West against them, and it is an existential threat to them. Whether we agree with it or not doesn't matter. They believe it. But if that is answered, if they have a success and their military success on whatever terms they choose, and it ends with the security on their border, there's no need for them to go back to war, and I don't think anyone would support it. So that's my view on that. Of course, that's speculation that we would have to get to if it actually came to it. But I think there's good reason to believe that what Russia had been saying from 2008 forward is probably pretty close to being accurate. That's what was driving them primarily, is their security on their border with NATO. Second thing, in terms of the equipment that Michael mentioned there, he talked about a lot of the stuff that we know we still have in our inventories, things that we could give, et cetera. There's no doubt that equipment is there in fairly large numbers, but I don't see any evidence that there's a willingness in the United States or any other NATO country to give away anymore. In fact, I see a lot of reticence to give away any more of that stuff. And look, we also can't get past the fact that after giving all of that stuff in 2023 and at least a full 6 months of prep time to get ready to use it, it didn't scratch the surface because they don't have enough air power. And even giving them a few F-16s is not going to change that any. They don't have enough air defense, and we don't have enough stuff to give them to bring it up to robust so it's equal to what the Russians have. And they still don't have enough mine clearing equipment. I haven't heard anyone even talking about that. And until you get all of that and the ability to have combined arms operations to breach minefields, then you're going to have the exact same outcome you had in 2023. But the other part that I really have a difference of opinion on is that while they're talking about all these things that the Ukraine side can do and that they're building and whatever, is that there's not a commensurate view on the other side that Russia is also doing those things, except they have a lot more advantages than the Ukraine side does. They don't have rockets and missiles bombing their factories left and right and their infrastructure like the Ukraine suffers from Russia all the time. They don't have enough air defense to defend against that, which Russia does, which is even if we gave some of these Storm Shadows or whatever, and our longer range stuff, which I know they're talking about now, but look, we don't have a lot of those missiles to give them. So it's not going to probably change anything. It will cost Russia more, but it's not going to change the outcome any. And then the last thing is look, we have to have a realistic outcome. I know that everybody wants Ukraine to win. Everybody wants Russia to lose, but it matters more what can be done, not what we want to be done. And I guess I'll just have to say that I disagree that there is any capacity to force Russia to go backwards and to reach a negotiated settlement that they don't want. Because right now, I view them in a definite position of superiority. And the manpower issue that Michael talked about is even far more acute on the Ukraine side than it is on the Russian side. And by no means that Russia has it good or easy, but they have the capacity. And they have millions more people to choose from than the Ukraine side, so they can't match that. And so I just don't see any evidence on the ground that would ever say that Ukraine can push back anything or force Russia into an advantageous position less than what they have right now. So the longer we wait, the more Ukrainian people die, probably the more territory they're going to lose. And later on, I think they're going to have a worse deal. That's just my assessment from my combat experience, my observation of spending time in Europe on the ground in some of these areas, and just my experience in the military affairs. That's what I think.
Mike and Emma, too, if you want, can you talk a little bit about sort of the balance of manpower? In your article, you did recommend, I think, that Ukraine do a big mobilization effort, which Zaluzhny had called for. And it's sort of mysterious to me, at least, why they haven't done that already. I mean, even given sort of Emma's preferred strategy, seems like I think it's 1,000 kilometers they need to man. They get different reports out about different kind of holes in their lines and undermanned units and so forth. So number one, how can Ukraine fix this manpower problem? And number two, how does that fit into the kind of strategy you're advocating? Mike,
please go ahead, Mike.
You're muted at the moment.
Oh, sorry. I apologize. Okay, so first, manpower. Look, manpower is an important conversation to have, but I think it's grossly overrated as an indicator. These are numbers on Excel spreadsheets, and those, as I like to say, do not fight in practice. Russia has a lot more people than Ukraine. That is true, but Russia does not have a 3-to-1 manpower advantage at the front. Russia's trying to sustain a force posture of around 300 to 350,000 personnel in Ukraine right now. It's not that much more than Ukraine actually has deployed in terms of its combat forces. The challenge Russia has is that on paper, these are advantages, but it cannot effectively mass forces. First, because it itself lacks the enablers to overcome a prepared defense, and also because it also cannot coordinate forces that well at scale. This is consistently demonstrated by combat performance. We saw them attempt a double envelopment early on at Avdiivka, and it failed, which led once again to attritional approaches. Ukraine is not out of manpower. It has more men and it has young men. This is a question of policy, of choices, and also of resources. For Ukraine to mobilize a lot more men, okay, has to take them out of the economy. The first order question is the West going to help supply the resources, training, and most importantly, equipment needed to generate additional brigades so that Ukraine can rotate units and restore its force capacity, right? Because without those resources, there isn't a lot of value to just mobilizing men if you don't have the ability to train and equip them, right? Yeah, you can call them up, you're taking them out of the economy, but you're not actually turning them into combat-capable formations, right? It is true that Russia's in a position of advantage right now this year, but that advantage is not yet decisive, though it could become so over time. But the thing that people need to understand is that this is a story of 2024. The interesting question is, what position do we end up in by 2025, right? There's one trajectory, in which case Russia's advantage builds over time. There's another trajectory, in which case Russia is relatively advantaged, but still very far from, or let's say short of, their ability to achieve their minimal war aims of capturing the Donbass, retaking the territories that they were pushed out of in Kharkiv, and what have you. Meaning they still are not able to achieve their minimal war aims despite their advantages on the ground. To Emma's points, I agree. There's an underlying strategic concern on distribution of resource. And I think people who vote on these things have a right to ask, what's the vision? What's the theory of success? And I think one area where the administration has done a very poor job since the failed offensive last year is explaining what are we going to do with these resources and what the strategy is. And I would completely concede that point. That said, I do think that sustainability to me is an alibi. We can easily sustain the war. I mean, we were the people who wasted 20 years in Afghanistan, during 10 of which it was very clear we wouldn't win. We're almost war sustainability kings. I'm not doing this as a comparison to Afghanistan. What I'm saying is, if we're willing to sustain a war like that, right, at a much higher price with low chance of winning, why is it so hard to pitch a war that is the right cost? The people you're actually backing on the ground genuinely want to fight, okay, for their country. The cost is much lower than the war in Afghanistan and Iraq on an annual basis. Nobody's saying it's a 5 to 10 year investment, okay? You're basically just trying to pitch a vision for the next 18 months which would substantially sabotage the Russian theory of victory, that they might have the war in the bag by 2025, 2026. Because if they don't, they then face a lot of uncertainty, and they're going to have a lot of problems and challenges, right? And that doesn't mean that Ukraine wins the war, but it does change the relative positions the two sides have in any potential negotiations. And lastly, about 2023. So I have to say, hang on here, because, okay, I've been doing field work in Ukraine on the front lines over the course of this war. I've been there multiple times. I was there during the 2023 summer offensive in the south, and I'm no stranger to this war. First, we did not provide Ukraine any significant fires advantage over the Russian military for this offensive, okay? Second, we gave those units barely 3 to 4 months of training, which is not enough to train a brigade to do pretty much anything, surely not to perform as cohesive units with a viable or like well-trained brigade staff. And if in reality, they performed about as you would expect a brigade that had around 3 to 4 months of training. Lastly, I think the point on enablers is right, but that's a problem that can be addressed. The reality is that 2023 was very much a rushed effort on a very compressed timeline with, to some extent, a questionable strategy behind it that heavily privileged maneuver warfare over a destruction-based approach. And while I won't go down that doctrinal rabbit hole, I will simply say that some of the underlying assumptions behind that effort failed. But just because that offensive wasn't successful doesn't mean that it cannot be done again, or can it be done better? I do kind of question the theory that you're willing to stick with a war until your first failed offensive, and after that you basically say, oh, well, we gave it the college try. I guess that's what this cause was worth. So better we have to call it. I mean, if you play it that way, most of your war efforts will be very short wars.
Emma, did you want to jump in there, or I got more questions if you don't?
Sure, yeah. I mean, so I don't have any particular extra comment on the manpower problem, which Mike would know better than I. I think, you know, again, this comes back to political realities, right? The debate over conscription in Ukraine is a debate about how many of their men, particularly the young men, which are in fairly scarce supply given the demographics of the country, how many do they want to throw into this? And that is a public debate, which actually I think speaks to Ukraine's, you know, that Ukraine is a democracy, that there are public support concerns, and that is a good thing from the point of view of the West. But again, that's a political question. It's a political question in Poland when we see, you know, farmers lobbying against government policy and making it more difficult to aid Ukraine. It's a political question in Germany when we see budget constraints, and it's a political question here where there are genuine concerns. And I concede the point that at current funding levels, this is something we can sustain. Though I'm not really sure I would lead with "we did it in Afghanistan, we can do it again" as my tagline here. But I worry that, you know, we are talking ourselves into, in some ways, a slightly similar situation to the one we were in Afghanistan. We can turn the corner if we try again in a few years option, or this year will be decisive. And, you know, my main concern about the more forward-leaning strategies in terms of we back Ukraine for a few more years and then, you know, then hopefully things turn around a little more. My main concern is that what I actually suspect would probably happen is what happened in Afghanistan, where we are never going to commit the resources we would actually need to achieve the insanely ambitious objectives that we have set ourselves. And instead we just muddle through, and we never throw enough resources at the problem for it to actually work. And so it just rolls on for some time, and maybe next year will be different. And so that is my concern about trying to make this a long-term endeavor.
With apologies to Mike, I'd like to get more into the some of these questions about combined arms warfare and particularly air power, but I do want to cover a couple of these interest-based arguments before we run out of time in 11 minutes. Number one, Mike, you made the argument that in disagreeing with Danny that the Russians have suffered previously in terms of equipment and manpower losses, and we shouldn't overstate their capacity to go on offense and break through. How does that, and this question is for everyone, although I'm putting it at Mike, how does that jibe with the argument that we have to worry about Russia's reconstitution all across Europe, and that the U.S., I guess you wrote another article in Foreign Affairs a while back with Rob Lee, I think, about this, that we shouldn't overlearn the lessons of Russian weakness and drawdown in Europe. I mean, in more broadly, how about this? Aren't there some important lessons about the durability of defense, speaking of Emma's article, that are great news for the United States coming out of this war, in that, the political or territorial status quo is much better in Europe, regardless of Russian confidence, and we can sort of be more mellow about our NATO commitments? Is that coherent?
Yeah, I mean, so if you want, I can take that on then. First, it's important for people to understand context, right? There's no such thing as like abstract military power. So the problem a lot of people have is they see a country and they see a country's performance in the war, and they say, well, what does that mean about this other situation or these other contingencies? And there's some things you can generalize, but the truth is that military power requires a context to express itself. The scenarios are different. The war aims are different. How forces are employed are different. And the actors involved are different. So you can't just easily point to Russian military in Ukraine and then say, so now we know what things look like 10 years from now in Europe, okay? What I think it's fair to say is that, yes, the value of defense and the difficulty of conducting this kind of operation was demonstrated in this war. For a second, the way Russian military conducted this operation is very clear that they did not prepare for a prolonged conventional war, nor did they think that they would be in one. And I think very few people imagined that Russia would invade a NATO member the way that they invaded Ukraine with those same assumptions. They would be greeted as liberators, that they could very easily conduct a coup de main and sort of overthrow the government and take over much of the country. Meaning the Russian invasion or the contingency with NATO members looks a bit different. But that said, it's clear that we overestimated, Russian force quality, organizational capacity, and the ability to employ force at scale. Okay, so it does teach us something about how much more viable defense is, and that maybe to some extent the threat is overstated. But on the other hand, you got to understand something, that Europe has expended a lot of its resources over the course of the last 2 years on this war. And what the war showed is that reconstitution for NATO militaries isn't about getting back to where they were 2 years ago. It shows that they were grossly under-resourced in terms of munitions available and the overall capacity to begin with, right? And the war does also teach us that, with Russia as an adversary, even on the offense, they're willing to sustain very high levels of attrition, lose a large chunk of the initial invading ground force, lose a lot of manpower, go back and get more. So it's a real challenge when you're dealing with an adversary that has the durability and resilience to sustain this level of cost. I think that if you look at the amount of money Russia's spending on defense right now, it's very difficult to throw a dart at the board and say at what point is it going to pose a real challenge. When you talk about Russian military reconstitution, you have to talk about in the context. Reconstitute to do what? If it's reconstitute to pose a threat to the territory of a NATO member, Estonia might say that for them, 3 years is a short enough timeline for Russian military reconstitution to pose a threat to them. Somebody else in Europe might say it's 7 years or 10 years. So it's very much scenario and context driven. And to Emma's point, so listen, I pulled Afghanistan because I know I thought it's a topic that you will enjoy. But the reason I used it is not to basically to draw analogies to compare and comparisons to it. It's the fact that we need to find a good middle ground in the conversation between, hey, let's just throw a few more resources at it, and success is around the corner just one more year, okay, which is a fair criticism to make. Like, do we actually believe that we can get there, or are we throwing just enough resources to kick the can down the road and not lose? And the other point of view, which is like the life philosophy that comes out of The Simpsons, where Homer says, trying is the first step to failure. Okay, yeah, sure. Maybe just what's the alternative to that? Should everybody just surrender? I mean, we cannot pursue a point of view whose main perspective is that we should just not try because there's a chance that it will result in the failure of the effort and success is far from guaranteed. Sure. But the cost isn't that high, and I think it's worth it. And we may disagree on that. We may disagree on those key parameters.
Either Emma or Danny want to get on this. Danny, why don't you go ahead? You've been quiet for a while.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, a couple of things I think are really important to point out there. Mike says that a lot of these manpower additions on the Russian side are on paper. I'll tell you what's not on paper. It's that Russia took Mariupol, Lysychansk, Severodonetsk, Bakhmut, and now Avdiivka, and they're now pressing in on many other areas there. Ukraine utterly failed in their offensive operations over 6 months in last year. Those aren't on paper. That's on the ground. That's the reality. And never would I suggest anybody give up because they had one failure. Nobody would ever do that. No one ever has. But it is foolish to continue going down a path that you cannot succeed on because all you're going to do is get more people killed. The second thing that I think is no one has even mentioned here, and it's not even popular to talk about, is that some of the tactical decisions made by the Ukraine side have been horrible. They stayed in Mariupol much too long and sacrificed thousands of men. They stayed in Bakhmut much longer than they should have before moving to better defensible positions. Again, lost tens of thousands of troops killed and wounded. And now they did the same thing here in Avdiivka before moving back. They waited way too long to start building much stronger defensive positions so that Russia can't exploit that there. Those are tactical decisions that could come back to haunt Ukraine, whether they get more weapons and ammunition or not. It's how you use them. And so far, they don't have a very good track record. And again, I will say at the end, though Russia did also do a lot of terrible decisions, especially early on, they are learning, but they have the capacity to overcome that. And my view, which I'm sure no one will agree with, is that there is a greater chance in the next 6 months that the Ukraine army breaks and collapses than there is that they're going to hold and push Russia back in the near future, no matter how much money we give them.
Emma, do you want to comment on this question of the larger lessons for U.S. foreign policy from kind of either the defensive advantages you talk about or Russian weakness? And while you're at it, if you want to say anything at all about the argument Mike made about the international norm of territorial integrity and how that might fit into this, how you might see it somewhat differently in terms of the outcome.
Sure, yeah, so just a few short questions. I somewhat agree on the question about territorial integrity, but it's not territorial integrity, it's sovereignty. And that is the norm that is important here from my point of view. And the sovereignty question has already been clearly answered in this war. I find territorial integrity to be a much more problematic concept because then you end up in these situations where, Ukraine has to retake every inch of territory for the war to end. No one has ever adequately explained to me after making that argument why the war would stop then. Why would Russia stop the war the minute that Ukraine retakes every inch of territory? Would the war not just continue at the 1991 borders? So, I see the same problems with reaching a peace deal through that approach as others would point to in other cases. Let me just say a few other things here. I think one thing from the point of view of U.S. foreign policy that really should be concerning is this point that Mike made about Europe has drawn down sort of a lot of their supplies, a lot of their equipment, and they are not backfilling that as effectively as they should be. They have not stepped up manufacturing capabilities, the defense space, the way they should have. Some of the promises have very much been dialed back. And I think, again, this is highly concerning for those who want Europe to carry more of its own weight in defense. It just seems like, again, they are just completely unable to get their act together on these things, even when faced with a significant problem like the one in Ukraine. The final point that I will make is just that I think I would like to just argue that it is not support Ukraine with absolutely everything or they fail. And so I'm just going to disagree with both Mike and Danny here. I think there are middle paths here. I laid one out. I think there are probably others. There are ways, I think, to enable Ukraine to keep fighting, to defend itself, to avoid significant losses, to avoid collapse, without necessarily pouring so much money and arms into this that we end up weakening ourselves strategically elsewhere. So I will conclude on that point of disagreement.
Mike, do you have any final remarks in 20 or 30 seconds?
Yeah, I think that what I was pitching was a middle path too. I think Emma and I are having there are some of small differences. Like I said, I think that Emma's middle path is like a bowling ball when you roll it, and it goes off to the edge, and at the end, it's going to veer off to the right into that lane. That's what's going to happen with defensive-only strategy, whereas mine has a chance of hitting something, if that's a serviceable analogy. But I'm not also proposing that the United States has to basically push all its resources, take everything out, and throw it at Ukraine either. We're proposing something that actually is feasible, can be accomplished over the next 18 months, has some chance of success. And if it doesn't, you still have a viable a hold strategy, and one that creates problems and challenges for the Russian military, at least puts them in significant uncertainty over the next year or two, as opposed to where they are now.
Thank you. There's a lot left to argue about, and sadly, we'll have to wait for another day. We're out of time. So thank you, all three of you, for doing this. I think it was a good discussion, terrific discussion even. And thanks everybody who watched or will in the future. And we'll be back with more live events from in this platform from Defense Priorities. Thanks, everybody.